Not this morning. Next one I can do. I'm just
and we're live. Pretty good. So this is the fourth time we're doing these interviews, part of Caesura magazine, new kind of series of conversations with artists. So just a little bit about Caesura. We are a magazine that publishes art, art criticism, poetry, literature. We do events throughout the cities. We're recently having a poetry series in New York City. We hosted Hauser Reading Group, reading the history of art written by Arnold Hauser. And we publish books with poetry criticism. We have an issue, a book of comics called Octave the Artist, and we have a lot of other books that are coming, which is very exciting for us. And it's great today to talk with Jeane Cohen. She's a great artist. She's based in Brooklyn, and I think that's all formal-ish things I'm going to say about this.
Yeah, so, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And when you told me about Caesura, it seems like a really great platform. So I'm feel grateful to be participating, and it is what you do.
Yeah, no, it was very exciting when we met. We met through the poetry reading. Because you were a friend of Barry, and Barry Shrabsky was co-organizing this with Caesura, and you had also kind of a little bit heard about it through the House of Reading groups. It was exciting for me to know that, we at least had there was this kind of distant connection with Caesura. But yeah, I mean, normally we've been starting these talks with just a very plain question about how you came to be a painter, like what kind of your story is in terms of, why doing this, why even trying to, a very particular profession that we find ourselves in. So,
yeah, yeah, I think how I came to do it, or to be doing this, is it's different from how I think about why I'm doing it. When I think about why I'm doing it, it feels really vital and necessary. And it feels like a part of my being. Although actually, it's probably connected to how I came to be an artist and focus on painting. Because I was always, from a very young age, even like a toddler, I was making or responding or playing in a material way. I have a memory of my mom showing me the mattress that I drew on maybe when I was 16 months old or something, with a marker. And so I think I always loved having things in my hands, holding things, putting things together. And I think it was innate. And I was really fortunate to have an environment. Both of my parents were happy to help cultivate my drives to create and to make things. My mother would roll out big pieces of paper in the hallway on the floor and give me a bunch of paints and let me play around. So I think that was a big part of it. And I also, in my extended family, I have, I was reflecting on this recently, but I have actually quite a lot of folks who are either architects or builders or craftspeople or fine artists. My uncle's a photographer, and when I was a teenager, maybe, or a young adult, he moved from Utah, where he was a landscape photographer, back to the East Coast. To he had a chronic illness, and he moved in with my grandparents in Maine. And so when I went to visit my grandparents, we would sit on the couch together and pore over contact sheets of his photographs and talk about composition and color and the landscape, which, you know, my work is very involved in landscape, and that feels very intuitive. But you know, that's an early influence that I think is probably you know, deeply connected and feels really close to my personal history.
And
yeah.
did you study before? Because I know that you went to the Art Institute, which is a nice connection, because we all went to the Art Institute about the same time, of Chicago. And so were you like drawing and doing paintings in like high school? Was it something like landscapes and things that you were doing like now, or how different was it? And also, just, you know, the Art Institute has this very particular approach, which is very multidisciplinary, and they kind of ask you to do other things, which is very, to me, is very interesting, what people end up concentrating in painting in that environment, because it does have a different commitment.
Yeah.
You would have gone to a painting school. So I wonder how what was your experience there too?
Yeah. Well, so before I applied to graduate school, I had many experiences with art education and fine art. My last 2 years of high school, I went to an visual art focused program. But after that, I went to a liberal arts school, and I thought of making and being in the world as something much broader than I guess my traditional drawing and painting practice that I had of making. And so I studied psychology, and I think I thought of creativity much more expansively in my day-to-day life. What happened is that I finished my undergrad education, and I had jobs working in social services and on community art and public art projects, and I was always painting all the time when I wasn't doing those things, and I had a full-on practice. And so I kind of realized that I had a momentum that I wanted some feedback on in a contemporary art sense, and that brought me to SAIC. I think part of the reason I chose to go there, I remember going on their website and seeing they had like 70 painting faculty, full-time and adjunct, and thinking that that's probably a good place to study with many different perspectives. I think I was able to focus. Like, I went knowing that I might branch out, but because in the way that you know, like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this in my life? I think like, oh, painting is very intuitive for me, and I keep getting pulled back there. And so you know, maybe one day that will change, but for now it's kind of like a fundamental habit that I have. And I found the school was incredibly nurturing as someone who wanted to focus on creating through paint. And I did actually end up getting a wide range of points of view, feedback, ways to think about seeing what the role of art is in the world. And, you know, I'm still thinking about a lot of the things that came up at that point. But what that allowed me to do in my practice was to really dive deeply into the forms that I was working with, both like compositionally on the actual picture plane and also my process. And I was able to become much more aware of how I make and why I make and what I draw from and how that gets translated. So there was a lot more examination, and I think if anything, the interdisciplinary nature of the school, it supported the focus in painting in this understanding that painting is one way and that there are many ways to explore these ideas. But yeah, that intense concentration on the particular form has allowed me to, it's provided enough depth for me to continue discovering and exploring.
So in terms of like the types of paintings that you're making now, it'd be also good to sort of get a sense like how you arrived at those in terms of like, you know, developing your practice, and sort of maybe some of the work that you were doing before, and, you know, the aspects of that work that sort of led you to the kind of work you're doing now. You know, I think it'd be good to sort of get a sense of, you know, where the concerns of your work or your current practice sort of came from.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. My work is deeply involved with nature and my perceptions of nature. Although it's not about me, but it's funneled through me and seeing the world. I think a lot of what that comes from is a curiosity of human experience through non-human form. And that might be the sort of thing where, you know, in some ways landscapes are portraits because they're just an outward understanding, right? Or there's some sort of organization or system about the presentation of the landscape that shows something internal, in the same way that a portrait can be, like an actual portrait of someone can be a moment in the landscape, or a kind of environment. I think there's like an inversion that I'm involved with, which you know, it is hard to boil down the essential elements. Something I'm thinking a lot about right now is reconciliation, or negotiating between seemingly disparate components. So that could be from painting to painting or within a single painting. I think that shows in my work over time, but what I mean is a lot of my curiosity is about patterns, not geometric patterns, but sequences and degrees of similarity and difference. And I'm interested in both like our processes as people who see, of linking and bringing things together, and also of the dissonance. That is ripe territory for me to throw my perceptual paintbrush at. So I think that it's taken me a while to realize that those are themes in my work. And it's come from seeing consistencies in my work over time. So these sorts of things, nature, psychological patterns, and certain humility or a genuine quality, which is also important in my work, has been there throughout. In my early 20s, I was making graphic novels and visual narrative books that were drawn and painted. So I was really following what felt like a good way to communicate my ideas, which had to do with the book format being both kind of a sculpture and a very intimate personal presentation. And then from there, when I went to grad school, I dealt and am still really in this territory with the traditional painting picture plane rectangular format, mostly large scale because of how I'm able to use my whole body in expressive movement, but also smaller scale works. Yeah. Is there like a thread there that I could flesh out more?
I mean, one thing, we could talk about potentially are some of the influences or, maybe other artists that are related to what you're doing. But that's one direction potentially. I don't know, Gabriel, if you have something else, another direction you might want to take things.
I think that's a good way to put it. But one question that I had a little bit with what you were saying is, there is this strange aspect of what you were mentioning, namely using landscape as portraits, which is really interesting, while at the same time not really being about you in the direct way. And the kind of vision that you feel that comes through, or like how you, I don't know, I want to know a little bit more about that. And the other one is, there is disparate elements, and one that I remember being interested when I was seeing your paintings and visited you was this a strange relationship between, and I think it's connected with the question before, between the vision of reality, you seemingly decide to really capture some object on the world, whether it's a flower or an animal, like you had that great horse painting that the horses were kind of turning around and going, plus the different feeling that you seem to bring through the expressive application of painting, the composition, the kind of work of that. So I do wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. And then it's very connected with the question that Patrick asked.
Yeah, because I think some of the artists that I was thinking of that are precisely related to what Gabriel was talking about. It's like Courbet and his landscape paintings, or his paintings of the hunt as well, and the way that the animal figures sort of function as these sort of stand-ins for the artist, and then like the relationship to the landscape. And that sort of seems to sort of be happening in it, in terms of like the relationship between figures and like the ground or the background in your paintings. And then, the other person that I think of is like Manet, in terms of like sort of grabbing these figures and kind of like almost collaging them in a strange way. The way that the figures relate in your compositions is kind of strange and interesting. Also, like Rauschenberg kind of comes to mind. But yeah.
This is great. Great meaty questions. Where should I start? Okay, so yeah, I think for some reason, I mean, not for some reason, you know, I'm putting together a picture of why this seems to happen, but yeah, I really do find myself in like the 1850s to 1900 European painting a lot, and that might have to do with this comes back to reconciliation, but negotiating the territory of perception in the age of mechanical reproduction. And it might be like that. And having all of these new subtle materials for appreciating aesthetics and perception and conveying it, you know, like the colors at that period of time were wide ranging, readily available. The amount of paint was, you could use a lot of paint easily without preparing it. And so I think there's kind of this symphony arising of a reckoning with self and city and animal and world in, and with Courbet, I do feel there's something emotionally evocative in those works, and genuine, a kind of empathy that I can feel he really has some pathos towards the things he's depicting. That carries over to the waves or the mountains, or, you know, really anything in addition to this kind of switching of you know, a superimposition of a person onto an animal, literally or metaphorically. And yeah, there is, yeah, Rauschenberg, you know, I think I have similar, and Manet with the photos. Yeah, I mean, some of those interests of collage, which I use as like just kind of like an action functional word as opposed to like literally what I'm doing, but it's a kind of weaving, or some of it probably has to do with the era that we're in of so many images and this kind of unusual relationship between disembodied images and experience and embodied experience, or like what is embodied internet experience, you know, like the feeling of my body as I'm scrolling through Google image. Part of it is that, but part of it is actually, yeah, Kathy Bradford came into my studio in the summer when I was in Maine, and she said something really smart about my work that I hadn't considered but has really stuck with me, which was that it's about searching. And I found that really helpful, because sometimes when I'm searching in the moment in the painting, I feel lost, but in the act of the search, if the work can be involved with the act of the search, then I'm exactly where I need to be. And it's a certain amount of position and permission and kind of relief. I think maybe I'll segue into the second two questions. Yeah, about a portrait. You know, not a portrait in the sense of that I'm depicting my face, but a portrait in the sense of, and also not in the sense of how one should see the world. It's nothing like that. It's more a kind of offering of how one might see the world, or a world in a moment. So the discovery is really moment to moment. I think I'm trying to capture something in the paintings that allows there to be a process of discovery of seeing, or a process of discovery of experiencing something that I've shared very directly. I think my paintings can be direct in different ways.
I did wanted to interject a little bit. That's something that came to mind, especially because of the curvette mention that Patrick did, and then you responded to, and I was like, oh, I didn't think about it that way, but it is like this question of finding yourself in the paint, this kind of involuntary, unconscious giving yourself to the painting is something that he was well known for. It, like the very famous phrase of like "il peint comme un bête." He paints like a sort of, they used to call him like an animal, but it was more like because he could let himself go in the painting and find things reflected on it that he may not have thought about it beforehand or predetermined. And I am really curious about your, you seem to be somebody, or at least I remember when we talked the first time, who has that kind of experience, who starts a painting somewhere and then the painting kind of takes you somewhere else, even when there's images that appear on it. And I guess that question of the involuntary nature of the giving yourself to the painting and working through that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. Like, as opposed to having a picture that you're going to copy from somewhere or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Because that is like having the picture that I'm going to copy is one component that occurs in the practice, but it's not the main aspect. Yeah, I think it's a lovely parallel to draw. So I'm very open when I first start a painting. Even if I have a plan, which a lot of the time I have a kind of sense of an idea. That could be like simply a color or a rhythm or a particular brush I want to use. And I might just start the painting. I've gotten better at this, but I do feel like there is a giving in the paintings. I think, most painters feel this way, that the painting will lead you somewhere and you have to be open to where it's leading, and what your wants for the painting have more to do with what you can offer to it as it develops, and less to do with a predetermined outcome. And so at least I find that really helpful. I know not everybody works this way, but so a lot of times what feels like in a very extreme U-turn in my painting, I've gotten better at sensing, actually right now the painting is going in a direction I need to kind of get on board with it. Sometimes that can mean that the painting is finished very quickly when I'm anticipating, 3 or 4 long days in the studio. Maybe it's a day and a half, and it's always surprising. I think a lot of what this process has to do is really leaning into the quieter voices in my mind that are speaking or whispering and saying, "Hey, what's going on there?" And making some room for them to consider more options in the painting than I ordinarily would. And so in that way, it's really, it feels, I haven't given birth, but it feels like a birthing process. And I think so when I was studying psychology, and with a focus on psychoanalysis in my undergrad and in my work in psychology in the time since, I think it's really given me a respect for unconscious processes. And I bring those into my work, and I'm open to them. And I think about, I don't remember who uses the term unconscious processes, but I heard it one time and it feels more apt. It's like negotiating, brain, heart, stomach. Like, I mean, I'm in conversation with my stomach, but I don't quite know how to speak to it with as much awareness as I know how to speak to my thoughts or my heart. So I'm aware that there's many, many things that in operation and act that are acting all together in my day-to-day life, but as I paint, and I really try to cultivate both what I'm aware of and what I'm not as I'm making the painting. And then, hopefully there's this moment where something appears, like a line or an animal, or sometimes it can be a complete removal. Like sometimes the paintings are at their best when I'm so frustrated with it that I try to completely wipe it away and start something new, which then actually ends up being the final mark of the painting. And so I'm trying to hold both the world in which I'm removing in that specific example or negating, and the world in which I'm finishing, or that's actually a release. And they're two things that seem like not like that they can't be there at the same time together, like in juxtaposition, but they're actually both necessary for the completion. And so that's what my process is like as I'm working. And sometimes I'm in a flow and it's like, yeah, it feels great, but I often don't know if that's later gonna how that moment is gonna realize in the work until like a week later, or until someone comes into the studio and says, oh, hey, that one.
Yeah, that's great. I was just talking to my girlfriend the other day about this problem, because I'm also a painter myself, but I was explaining to her that the only, like, when you feel like you're actually developing or pushing yourself as an artist is actually when you're getting to that point where you're not really sure if what you're doing is actually good or not. And so it's like, as you approach the edge of failure, like that's where you're actually growing and developing the most.
Yeah, totally. And it's and I wonder about that. Like, what is that threshold? Is that to do with being that when you're in unfamiliar territory, something can pop up because you don't know it yet? Or I wonder if that's also just the freedom of not needing anything anymore. Like if you accept failure, maybe then something can come through because your needs are gone. Yeah.
I mean, a little bit, it does become the question of what do you, the painter is ultimately the first viewer of the painting. And so what is the act of finishing the painting is judging that it's a product that is worth of aesthetic experience in relationship to great paintings you've seen, namely, I think this is good. It really means a connection with other paintings which you have seen on the world and you think are great. And I think there is the doubt in that moment when you are like, I'm not really sure. The question comes, is this really creating something new that perhaps I'm not capable of understanding right now? And maybe somebody else will. Or perhaps not. It's like, okay, maybe it's not great.
Yeah. Yeah. It goes both ways, right? I mean, yeah, I have all different kinds of paintings on that scale in my studio. I don't know if it's the same for you, Patrick, but I think, yeah, getting it to something finished. It's so strange. And I keep changing my relationship to finishing work too. I've gotten more and more comfortable letting something leave my studio if I think it's unfinished, but that I accept that, and more comfortable going back into something I thought was finished, and extending it. And there's definitely phases of paintings where I guess I could say they feel stronger, or they have more overall integrity, in some sense, or maybe they're more independent. But then there are paintings that I let leave the studio, which, to me is a kind of finished, where I just feel that they're very genuine to me, or that I've very honestly expressed something. And that can be enough too. Even if it's not, doing like triple formal backflips or something. I'm happy to have things that feel close to me in that way and consider them finished.
So I have a slightly related, slightly unrelated question, which has to do with what you think about the situation of contemporary art today, and where your work fits into that. I mean, I know that's a big question, but I think it's related in the sense that, like, I think part of what goes into that judgment that Gabriel was talking about, in terms of sort of deciding that something is done, or that it can leave the studio, it is sort of measuring it up against history, but in the sense of like history as it leads up to now. So it's also a judgment of not just how it compares to the past, but also in a way that it sort of also fits into the present, or can also maybe channel the past into the present. So yeah, I guess I wonder how you think about that kind of dynamic, where where you see your own practice sort of fitting in with what's happening today, or maybe not fitting in.
Yeah, it's a really important question. I didn't it took me a while to understand how exciting it is to look at art from all around the world, and like from all ages. And I think I tend to look at things with an kind of stepping back and looking at the overall picture view. And I'm very aware that, like the traditional Western canon, as it's told, at least like how I experienced it with my education, and what's in the museums currently, it's a pretty recent history that was put together. I mean, like last 100 years, or a little lot more than that. And so I think of it as a malleable story. I like to think of the narrative of art history as something that we get to create and cultivate together. And especially when I go to lectures of artists who are many generations ahead of me, a lot of the people they talk about influencing them I've never heard of. And I'm very curious about artists. I dive into and learn about whoever I can. And I think I'm aware of how fluid things could be, and maybe not fluid enough right now, but I really like to bring that into my idea of what art history can look like. That said, I think I'm continuously humbled every time I go to museums and the galleries and with other artists and creative practitioners that I admire about really how strongly and deeply they consider what they do and apply their strengths in their practice. And, you know, whether or not they're living. The fact that there's this enormous archive, like right now, I'm in Brooklyn and New York City, and I can go to the Frick, or I can go see 5 gallery shows in a couple hours easily, of artists from all over the world is, it's an enormous privilege. And it's also, it keeps me aligned with really putting my best foot forward. I think, I mean, I know a lot of the work of Caesura is thinking through contemporary art now. I both care about tradition and form and breaking the traditions and form. I mean, I think a lot of my images can look very classical. Sometimes they can look ordinary, even. Other times they can look more experimental. I really want for my work there to be this direct channeling of a range of life experiences into the work that then hopefully there's a moment of reckoning or translation that happens for people as they look at them. I think I'm also very aware of this particular period in human history where, you know, you never know what the future holds, and yet there's such a global awareness right now, as well as a global amnesia. And, you know, we don't know what the world is going to look like in 80 years or 10 years. I try to be really in the present and not in denial. And I think that's what a lot of great artists through history have done, is they work with what's in front of them in the time. You know, like Goya, I feel like he's just kind of a good go-to person for this. And yeah, I think we'll see how and where I fit into art history. I, you know, feel really grateful to be able to, you know, have some visibility for what I make. And I also, in terms of contemporary art, I try to keep my practice wide-ranging insofar as I need it to be. I love exploring many directions at once and many themes and ideas, and I love tangents. Tangents are an enormous part of my practice. Jumping around, trying different things, experimenting, which for the last 5 years has been exclusively within the painterly frame. But it feels really important to have an expansion or diversification of what I can and do paint, because I do feel so much I think many people find it scary to see that range, but the range is like healthy and playful. Like to keep the studio practice playful, it feels really like good for me, good for other people when they come, and where a lot of the really exciting things happen. So I try to keep a practice that allows for expansion and a really direct translation of my range of experiences. I hope, when I am in conversation with other people about that it allows them to cultivate a creative practice that's broader than they could originally conceive of. In an ideal situation, might yield that.
I guess one thing that comes to mind to me is, what is true to me about the kind of different ways in which people can express themselves creatively today, both like mediums, but also within a medium, like in painting, is that there is just a sheer variety of experiences that we have now in the world. And that it is really like, the modern world, the kind of world that began in the 19th century for us, has expressed itself in a just sheer immense variety of things. I think about, always had this kind of question with artists like, Richter or Picasso, would have like an enormous range variety of styles, just like sheer craziness, from like linear drawings to weird, crafty looking sculptures or abstract paintings and hyper realistic things. And, the fact that there is just simply, in kind of the modern world that we live, there is that tendency of expansion, while at the same time, I think it tends to be destructive sometimes. It does tend to cause people to try a million different things without the further self-reflection of which, going in depth in something sometimes drives you to. It does kind of, it is different to try painting one style and then painting a different thing and just jumping around without really the experience of that digging deep into what you may find through that form. Which it's just kind of, I don't know, it is a very strange painter's problem. Namely, you do have, though, the variety of experience that the world has, city, nature, your everyday life, history, mythology, unconscious, whatever. You also have the whole history of painting, in which you're all constantly looking back and thinking about the ways that people have used this very basic stuff like brushes, paint, palette knife, and canvas, or whatever. It's like, there's a sheer amount of possibilities,
right?
And being open to those is both a challenge, but also like I don't know, it's kind of a strange thing there.
Yeah, it's kind of awful and wonderful. It's, oh my gosh, like you can do anything and there's too many options. And it's like terrible in the same way of when you like run out of toothpaste and you go to the grocery store and there's literally a whole aisle of different toothpaste. And like, it's like sometimes I try new toothpaste. Sometimes, there's like this, I guess it can get to a place of overwhelm, or it can get to a place of, like the whole, like not staying with the trouble, Donna Haraway thing, or not remaining. Maybe it has something to do with that. I think, I talk about the range in one sense, and then at the end of the day, actually, my practice is really simple. I go to the studio, I'm flexible, I don't know what's going to happen, and I just make, and sometimes there are days where I'm trying to push myself into, a new technique or something, a lot of the times it's pretty organic, whatever comes out. And so that does actually feel really consistent to me over time. And staying with like the broader themes that come out, you know, I notice them. It's kind of like, maybe it's like tending a garden, you know, like I do wind up having these series of things, but I don't paint them like all in a row. I come back to them, you know, like maybe I'll paint a starfish painting and then I'll paint a fire painting and then I'll paint an abstract painting or combination of all three. And, you know, I go over to one section of the garden and tend to it and weed it and water it. I go over to another section of the garden. Things are ready for harvesting at different times. You know, I think the content of my work remains stable, and there are shifting subjects, I guess, is what I would say. And yeah, I mean, it is so strange to be in such an enormous history, but it feels like one of the ways that I can be connected to previous generations, and really from all across the world. It's remarkable. And sure, like some painting traditions have been lost in history, and that's really unfortunate, and a lot of them have been preserved, and it's kind of amazing. And so having access to a wide range gives me like a sense for what's important, which is yeah, the searching, really trying to summon up something that's celebratory or emotional, or feels like I can show it to someone and say, hey, this is one part of what it's like to be alive in the world right now.
Patrick, unless you have another question, should we do some paintings?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Just looking at time. Talking about a starfish.
Oh yeah. This one's an octopus. But I do have a starfish in here, and they're very similar. So the paintings that we're looking at are some of the work I've done in like the last handful of months. And I think like they provide good examples of the kind of continuity and range.
Should we, do you guys wanna choose one? Well, we'll get to that one later.
Let's start with this one. That's the starfish. We can start with this. This one is well paired, I think, with the Van Gogh image that I included that we can look at now or later. But and you know, this one is squarely in the 19th century. These works are pretty new, so I'm, you know, they're still telling me things. Like that one I did last week, and actually it's quite unusual for me to share work that's that recent. I think I like, ideally, if I don't have a show or something, I like to wait 6 months. So I'm taking a, you know, it's good that I'm taking a little bit of a it's new for me to share fresh work like this. Yeah, what would you like to hear about it?
Well, it's interesting to have the the division be down the center of the starfish. It does sort of decentralize it as the focus or the subject of the painting. I don't know, I guess it sort of reminds me a little bit of like the baselets, the bosslets like move of like flipping the paintings upside down so that you're no longer like looking at the figure, but you're paying attention to the way that it's painted.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you brought that up. And I think Joan Mitchell comes up a lot for me with this, because she's just got those two paintings that she puts together all the time. But it's not like, it's not like I go to a Joan Mitchell show and then come back to my studio and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm gonna put two paintings together. It's just, it's a thing that now has happened a lot. And, Gabriel, when you came to the studio, there was that painting with the owls and the fish. And, we were talking about, I think, the division or the diptych in that painting. And I don't think I included it here, but yeah, a friend of mine said something about when we were having a conversation about my work and how I often will situate something like really centrally and really at the front, and this is the thing, and it's a monumental expression of here it is. And she was saying that these like diptych divisions are just like a way of understanding unity and duality at the same time, which, I like that. I guess it's a different kind of edge, like, so I use this example when I'm teaching, but the painting is like a drum. And so, it makes noise at every point in the drum, and yet the tension is slightly shifted and the tone is slightly shifted, depending on, where you press and where you poke, and yet it's all connected. And so, so the edges have a slightly different resonance than, regions more centrally located. And so then you're dealing with all of those inherent things when you decide to put a many-legged starfish right in the middle of your work. Then it's kind of, it's like an overlay of this central periphery relationship that you have to navigate in addition. Yeah, I kind of, it's interesting to think of the tension and the fighting of, the edge actually being a continuation, right? Like that's the only edge in the painting in which there really is a form that's being continued. I guess along the bottom, the legs go off a little bit, but there's a kind of understanding that that's where the image is cropped, as opposed to that actually the figure continues. And yeah.
Actually, I did want to ask you, the two things that come right away to me, and maybe it's because I saw some of them in your studio, and so I was kind of primed to think about it, was the bottom edge of the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There is this moment in this painting where there is this weird ambiguity of the starfish is kind of coming to you, like inclining and being kind of on this side of the canvas. It's obviously cut to insinuate that, but it's also kind of turning around. And there is a kind of like push, like as if it were pushing you out of it, creating space in it, which I find very interesting. And I've seen it in other of your paintings, this question of like really what to do with that lower part of the canvas.
I know, right?
So maybe we can go there first, like have another one.
Yeah, I know, it's so interesting. And this is why Van Gogh keeps coming up for me, actually, is because because he actually dealt with that like lower section oftentimes really well, or he'd like bring it right up to the base of his feet. But yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out why this happens. Like there does seem to be this lower region. It's like a different spatial register is what happens. And yeah, I guess it probably has to do less with the edge of the painting and more to do with the, like negotiating gravity, or like how to bring the viewer in, because the bottom of the painting is always so different from the top. You know, the top is linked to outer space and the bottom is linked to us. I mean, I think very directly. And so it's interesting to me that there's a kind of cropping, like a more finite edge and flattening out there. And yeah, it is kind of coming towards us, but then, you know, right where we would connect, it kind of either goes off the screen because we've connected, or it goes, or it flattens out because there's this kind of like, you can't bridge the illusion the whole way.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's helpful for me to think about, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it also does help create the sensation that you're looking down a little bit. And it may be, again, I didn't see this one the last time, so I'm kind of going off the picture, but the effect of going down as opposed to being on the flat plane of the canvas, it's very, you know, it kind of gets emphasized by the curving of this. And also the kind of painterliness. And that was my other question. I mean, there is like the very blur, very ambiguous painterliness at the center of it. It's just where you would think you could look at, namely in the center of the starfish is this blue or kind of more, you know, tactile feeling of the orange brushstrokes. While on the background, you have a much more, wait, go another way. I said it wrong. It was like more like kind of visual, like optical at the center, like you could see, but then the sides you have this kind of things that you can feel. So as if these larger reds and larger purples and larger greens give a kind of more like tactile feeling, like as if it were like rocks or something, like the feeling of like the ground where the starfish may be sitting.
Yeah.
As opposed to the fact that it sort of vanishes into thin air at the center of it.
Yeah, look at that. Yeah, isn't that like it's like a reverse horizon line or something, or horizon center, or like yeah, I mean, maybe that's like a good way to think about the thing I was trying to explain about landscape and portrait. But also you know, it's something about the optical field too, probably. And I love what painting can do as it dissolves into itself materially, and what it can do in the illusion, you know. And yeah, there are other moments too where things don't quite connect, or they repeat, like this lining up of things into space versus the experience of looking at something. I think this is where my work has a lot to do with perception, and that there's a translation going on of what it's like for me to look at these things, or you know, what happens when you do kind of zoom in to a creature that you see, you know, if you go to the zoo or the aquarium or something, and you know, you get really lost in certain parts. It's not like when you look over the whole thing, it's not like you're like a rover on Mars. You're getting pulled in different directions, and there's different ways that you're looking at the different aspects. So yeah, this brings awareness to me that I'm like very involved with the specificity of, you know, the ocean floor, and then it's almost like that's the structure for letting the starfish kind of release into legs and amorphous body.
Should we choose another one?
Yeah. Let's do this one.
This one, Patrick, for your orientation and for people that are listening, is large. It's like a huge kind of life-size painting.
Yeah, it's 6 feet by 5 feet. Yeah, I was thinking recently about the role that drawing plays in my painting, and you know, there's a big differentiation. I mean, when we talk about history between drawing and painting, but I guess, you know, the way I'm thinking about the difference right now is more in terms of like the quality of organization of ideas that it provides. So like drawing is linear, continuous, it's a trajectory. Whereas when I think of painting, I think of that the space and the color and the composition as space are actually the kind of first, like the primary aspects of experience. And so what I was thinking about with this one, looking at it, you know, afterwards, is that actually it's both drawn and painted. Like, and maybe even the drawing or the linear qualities are secondary in some ways, because yes, there's a lot of line that's structurally significant and dominant, but actually the depth and the color and the emotion is actually at the center and holds the painting with a kind of wobbly strength. So that's what I'm tossing around in my head at the moment.
Yeah, it has this very strange, like, what would you call it? I mean, to me, it is sort of immediately recalls the sort of grand, like, Renaissance paintings of like the heavens with these sort of, you know, swirling like groups of angels and cherubs and saints, but sort of like dematerialized here. Or, you know, there's even sort of a little bit of like Michelangelo's you know, vision of hell with all of the like falling bodies.
Yeah, like where's gravity? And yeah, and I look at Tiepolo. I love looking at Tiepolo because he's like, and all those Renaissance paintings, particularly, you know, they're on ceiling, you know, or they're in like weird nooks. And so the sense of composition is, and you know, you can, if you're dealing with cherubs in the air, then, you know, of course the gravity is like, there's all kinds of churning. It's, you can get to it in the same way with an abstract painting. But also, you know, I was turning this in all kinds of directions as I was working on it. And, you know, which I often do with my paintings. But there is an actual rotation going on in the making of this, not just in the kind of circular churning marks.
I'm thinking of just looking at some of Delacroix's like ceiling paintings, being kind of similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like he was sort of looking at those the same painters, and especially somebody like Rubens, and sort of taking the kind of like, I don't know, sort of taking the kind of like arabesque form and kind of like getting like drawing like color out of it in a certain way. I mean, there's also like I mean, Delacroix is always sort of juxtaposed traditionally to Ong as like, color versus line kind of division in 19th century French painting. But with Delacroix, there's still also this kind of like nervous line that sort of is there, or that, it's sort of like what forms his figures, or the horses. Is this like, sort of shaking or like undulating line that there's a lot of in this painting as well.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of brings me back to Gabriel's other question from the beginning that I didn't get a chance to answer about, the energy of like, or like, what is reality, and the, I guess, expressiveness. Sometimes, like in your example, Gabriel, I think you brought up in relationship to the animals, but here, here it's like a quivering, or I mean, I've embraced a love of clunky sensuality or something, or whatever variations on that juxtaposition. And yeah, Delacroix is like, he's all in that. Although I feel like he's goes to kind of an extreme place with it, but yeah, like that's like the action and the marks, and the nervous energy, or the questioning, or the fully assertive, whatever the range is, it feels important to me as I'm working that I do commit to those things, even if it is committing to hesitancy. But that feels like how I can try to get some sort of resonance. And that's when I start to think about things like pattern and sequence, and rift and union. And in this painting, like it happened quite naturally, like the different near and far churning depth spaces and the color came about through my commitment to whatever like emotions or bodily experiences I'm having as I'm making the marks.
Yeah, the center part sort of, or like the way that the sort of sides and the top and bottom of the painting, there's this kind of like circle that is sort of like emphasized in the center, again, sort of like the Starfish painting, where you sort of have like this absence of detail or void in the center that sort of draws you in. It also sort of reminds me of that there's like, I think a couple maybe of Cezanne paintings of this sort of like path in the forest. And it has that kind of sort of like feeling where you have these, where visually, like, or, painting wise, like what's happening most is sort of like around the edges, or sort of away from the center, but it sort of has the effect of wanting to like make you go into the center. I don't know. Yeah, it's very similar to what's happening with the Starfish painting. But it's an interesting sort of problem to think about, that like what captures your attention is also what is trying to move you away, like from itself in a certain way. It's like the edges and this kind of like form that really grab you at first, but like what they sort of turn you towards is like the center, and there's actually not less going on, but it's a different kind of there's a spaciousness there.
Right. Yeah. And like the warping that can happen within a single painting. Yeah, that's really a good point. I think this particular, I guess we can call it compositional aspect, or that parallel, is definitely, you know, comes up frequently in a lot of my work. I try to you know, actually also maybe that duality that's coming up is similar to the duality of the diptych, also in you know, putting two things together and having a kind of split in the middle. You know, maybe there's something there too of like balancing two fundamental things and then having the rest of it unfold around that.
Let me move to another one. Why don't we look at the Van Gogh, since we've been talking so much about it?
Yeah. Yeah. I just went to the Met and like last week, and yeah, they have this, and I think, you know, it's not like one of my favorite paintings of his or anything, but I love how direct it is, and it is what he sees. And I also do feel like a lot of emotional connection to it, sensitivity to the rake and, you know, the workers at the orchard. I love, and now I'm thinking about our conversation and a kind of like slipping that we've been talking about at the bottom. I love the slipping that he has at the top there. I mean, really, it's just like one or two branches that connect to the rest of the purple tree. You know, in the top left corner, it kind of just transitions into this vague sky with levitating branches space. And his drawing qualities are really, really exciting to me. Yeah, even though the painting it's quite ordinary. And yeah, maybe there's like a quivering anxiety in all of these lines too. I think I also love how annoyingly green the grass is. You know, I mean, and yet there's actually still a whole color world in there. It feels like he's like both overly saturating and working with a color creatively. And yeah, like his love for the individual branches really shows through. That's something I relate to as someone who paints trees a lot. So it's like his hand is moving with, like, it feels like this painting is like a sketch that's also a dance. It's moving with the things as he sees them.
Yeah, there is the weird just feeling of the drawing. Like it says, I mean, obviously it's the size right now, but as if you can feel his hand going through that branch that goes across. You can, like, you know, it is the kind of just like beautiful marking that he can get through a thick line of paint, which is, I think, what made me, when I first visited you, I was very surprised when you start talking about drawing. I was like, oh, you know, I was looking at all this like painterliness and all this like use of color and these large canvases just kind of splashed with different paints. And then I was like, no, it does make sense. It does have this quality of trying to draw with paint and trying to put those lines and the movement of lines and give them a kind of weight and value in the painting. in the Van Gogh is very simple. It feels very kind of peaceful. It's also the fact maybe that he chose to do it's his very Japanese painting to me.
Yeah.
Like the white background and then the kind of very delicate drawing on top of it. Or as you notice, like the big, just large area of green that he covers with small marks of something that it still enriches it, but you don't lose the green tone. It's sort of still very heavy.
Yeah. And I love like the range of finished and unfinished areas that you can get because of how he's using drawing. And having like the shift of spaciousness to image to texture. But yeah, I spent so long trying to forget about drawing when I was learning to paint because, you know, there is some of this. And then within the last year, I was like, oh, well, that's silly. Like, you know, they're together, and you know, I wonder what would happen if I start thinking about drawing again more overtly, you know, as like a viable kind of mark or approach within this the spacious depth of whatever I'm working on. Yeah.
I guess one question that comes to me, and maybe we can think about wrapping it up whenever you guys feel about it, but we're already an hour and a half and we don't want to kill it and make it, you know, get much of your time. There was two things that, there was one thing that Patrick mentioned, and then looking at this painting, the vision of this like strange Baroque paintings of heaven where you have this shallow but also infinite space that seems to go in, and it's sort of evoked in the painting that we were talking about. And then this modern type of looking where it's obvious that Van Gogh is just kind of going out, walking around, you know, the backyard or and he happens to look at this and it feels like somebody just walking by. It's like a very unpretentious scene.
Yeah.
My question is like, you know, these different ways, visions, forms of seeing that painting has. I feel that sometimes painters today feel like they have to choose one or the other. It's like, oh, painting a modern life, and so you're gonna just walk around and paint and look at things, which is part of our experience of, you know, going around the world, and it's obviously doing that. But then there is also these very different kind of visual forms that were created through painting churches, that's kind of imagination of heaven and the world beyond and the connection between the two and all those kind of things that they are still part of the history of seeing and what can be happening in the present. And so I do wonder how you guys just think about that. Think about what those kind of possibilities, those kind of things, like also not just in the way that in the kind of more practical, oh, painters used to paint like this or that, but in the more like a bit perhaps more distant, but still kind of concrete ways in which painting can create these visions. Whether they are something, you know, what do they mean? What does it mean to have those for us today? And especially as you guys who are, you know, painters.
Yeah, I love that question. Patrick, did you have a thought or should I jump in?
Sorry, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about how other animals with eyes see. And I wonder about like early stages of development too, in like for infants and children, you know, because you do have to learn how to focus and how to see. And you know, there's no way to see outside of the era. So even though it's really exciting to look at different ways of seeing in different painterly traditions like medieval or you know, paintings of the Near East and the Mughal Empire and or like Tibetan Buddhist paintings. You know, there's a very wide range of looking. It feels on the one hand really amazing to be able to kind of peer into what seeing might have been like before photography. And then on the other hand, I'm very aware that I'm looking at these things from the point of view of someone who was born 100 years after photography was like started being widely disseminated. So it's a question. It feels though like it's something that painting can really tackle, is ways of seeing, particularly because of the direct like movement and responsiveness with kind of hand, eye, mind, body, and mud and stick. So it feels like it can unlock something in the psyche at its best that does kind of expand beyond one way of seeing. But I'd be curious what you think, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, for me, it's like there's both a continuity and a discontinuity with like all art, in the sense that, you know, I do think that there is a break that happens, or, you know, that there is like, yeah, something that happens beginning in the Renaissance and, you know, really sort of accelerating in the 18th and 19th centuries, that there was an understanding of like looking at these various kinds of practices as art, whereas, you know, previously, I think, you know, they would have been understood differently, you know, related to religion, related to different kinds of like life practices, you know, really parts of different worlds. And so while we, you know, maybe don't have access, or, you know, are no longer sort of able to experience the world like in that mode, you know, I think there is still something about, you know, so while we've lost like that aspect of things, what we have gained is like being able to think about them as like images. And to me, that's not necessarily this like the same as like losing it all together, because I think at the same time, like what was sort of like accomplished is sort of like, or like, yeah, that there was some sort of like freedom gained, you know, starting in the Renaissance and then in the 18th and 19th century, of understanding sort of like the process of perception itself, of vision itself, of like images as sort of being sort of related to, you know, our spiritual connection to the world, you know, kind of cosmological order. And so even though it's no longer through like religion that we're trying to like approach these things, there is still a kind of like connection through sort of trying to understand like the power of, you know, making images, or sort of having an aesthetic experience. And so, yeah, maybe we no longer have the kind of same kind of religious ecstasies, but we have, you know, art, which offers that same kind of possibility, or, you know, is sort of the afterlife of that kind of world. So yeah, it's complicated.
I mean, I feel like, even if we may not have the religious ecstasies that drove these people to paint bodily form ethereally going to heaven and this kind of infinite space where the spirit can travel or something like that, we do still enjoy, our imagination does create a similar feeling just with the life that we have, with the kind of experience that we have with other people, with all sorts of things. And that's probably why we feel a resonance to those things. Like, it's like why those paintings don't, or those forms of art have not just kind of disappeared that much, is because they still, in a kind of non-direct way, speak to experiences that we happen to have. And I guess be the kind of recognition of that non-identity might want to be too complicated about it. Like the fact that they are similar, but they're not really the same. It can enrich a relationship with those things. It really does, because it doesn't create the confusion that that's really what we are living. But it does notice the possibility of recognizing how it can be expressed.
Yeah. Yeah, which is like a beautiful take on reality. That it's like the possibility, right? It's not less real just because we're seeing it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not giving for the nihilism of the present. It's like not feeling the present is the end of times in which everything's been too late. Like that, like why? This has been great. Thanks for talking with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation and continuing.
Mm-hmm. We should hang out. I'll text you.
Sounds great. See you soon. Okay.
Nice.
Have a good Sunday.